On Thursday, we marked the halfway point on this 40-day journey to Easter we call Lent. It is, for the record, a 40-day count that does not include Sundays. That's why there's Sundays in Lent rather than Sundays of Lent. File that under fun facts to know and tell about the liturgical calendar. And so we gather tonight for Lenten Evensong. We are slightly over halfway there. But wasn't it just Ash Wednesday? Didn't we just gather in this place to hear the familiar words of invitation to a holy Lent and receive the imposition of ashes on our foreheads as outward and visible signs of the inward and inescapable reality that we are dust, and to dust we shall return? Time flies when you're having Lent doesn't quite capture it, but it does seem to me this year that we have collectively been stuck in some kind of cosmic fast-forward mode, due in no small part to the nonstop news cycle, spinning from breaking news of one fresh disaster to the next. And so I am particularly grateful for this evening, for this moment, to hit the pause button, to gather in this room where it happens, surrounded by light and beauty and music and each other, to mark the halfway point in this 40-day journey to Easter that we call Lent. This year, in response to the baptismal promise to persevere in resisting evil, I framed my Lenten discipline around the call to sacred resistance, something the aforementioned news cycle has helpfully provided no shortage of opportunities to exercise. And my Lent 2017 soundtrack has been Hamilton. Perhaps you've heard of it. It is the show that has captured the imagination of the nation, the story of our founding fathers and mothers as they engaged in the 2 steps forward, 1 step back journey of imagining a new nation, a new reality, a new way of being in the world, a retelling of the events that turned the world upside down for the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hamilton has been the soundtrack for my Lent, in part because it's brilliant musical theater, and in part because its narrative offers a powerful antidote of hope and positive energy in a world that seems to have been turned upside down by polarization, demonization, and the pursuit of profit. I've listened to it in my car over and over and over again in place of my usual endless stream of breaking news, and I have to say, I am better for it. And one of Hamilton's refrains that has echoed in my head during this first half of Lent is framed as a question. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? Who tells your story? What frames your narrative? Who or what has the power to make meaning from the events, hours, days, months, and years of a life, of a person, or of a nation, or of a faith? In the end, the Hamilton story is the story of the deeply flawed founders of our nation in general, and Alexander Hamilton in particular, managing, sometimes in spite of themselves, to jettison the divine right of kings and create a new nation dedicated to the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. And yes, for women, we are still working on that sequel. And the Hamilton story also tells us that they did it in the middle of chaos and uncertainty, with the threat of tyranny on one side and anarchy on the other, and an ongoing cycle of news of fresh disasters. Nevertheless, they persisted. And telling their story helps us go and do likewise. Meanwhile, in counterpoint to the Hamilton narrative this Lent, the other stories that have informed my journey so far are the scriptural stories that have been appointed for our study and inspiration. We've heard about Nicodemus, the temple leader, struggling to get past the literal words born again in order to understand God's call to live aligned with the spirit of love, justice, and compassion. We heard about the Samaritan woman who struggled to understand the difference between the literal water in the well where she met Jesus and the living water he told her would change her life. This morning, we heard about the House Intelligence Committee, the Council of Pharisees and Sadducees, who struggled to understand how a man who'd been born blind could now see, and who were intrinsically unwilling to receive any actual facts that ran counter to the alternative fact they had already made up their mind about, rejecting the idea that anything good could come from anything that had anything to do with that radical rabbi from Nazareth. Finally, this evening, we heard Jesus warn the disciples, keep your eyes open. Be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And we listened to them respond, OMG, he's saying that because we forgot the bread for the field trip. The very disciples who've been traveling with Jesus, listening to his teachings, witnessing the miracles he is working in the lives of those they encounter, are still so clueless that our scriptures tell us Jesus reprimanded them, saying, are your minds closed? Have you eyes that do not see and ears that do not hear? You saw me feed 5,000 people, and you still don't understand? I don't know about you, but I know that for me, being reminded through these stories that we come from a long line of scriptural ancestors who didn't always get what was going on right in front of them is sometimes oddly comforting, especially when I'm struggling to find it out for myself. While there is a lot going on in all these stories, the one thing they have in common is how commonly the good news of God's transformative and abundant love is right in front of us, and we can't see it. Blinded by fears, prejudices, past experiences, or internalized toxic narratives, it is far too easy to let someone else tell the story, our story, God's story, and in the process lose the power to be agents of change, to change the narrative, to be instruments of God's love, justice, and compassion in a news cycle dominated by fear, injustice, and oppression. And one of the things I've learned this Lent from Hamilton and from Jesus is that when we claim the power to tell our story, however we tell it, we have the power to change not only our own lives, but the lives of others. And that brings me to Bach. It's difficult to imagine a more tranquil, contemplative, hopeful, and joyful testament of faith than the work we hear tonight. As James Walker's program notes tell us, Bach's life was marked by tremendous loss. Both his mother and father died before he was 10. His first wife died at the age of 35, and he lost his brother the same year. While blessed with many children who lived into adulthood, he and his 2 wives lost 10 children as newborns or young children. In the midst of such loss, Bach's fervent belief in a just, wise, and loving God remained steadfast. The text of the cantata is illuminated by the brilliant expressiveness and passion of Bach's music. Acknowledging our mortality and calling us to live life fully, Bach leads us to the comfort peace, and joy of God's gentle and loving hands, trusting in the divine power that gives us victory over death. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? The refrain from Hamilton illumines the story of Bach, who told his story through music that has inspired generations, a story of life and death, and ultimately trust in the love of God greater than any challenge we face or tragedy we encounter. The Lenten journey is halfway over, and as we continue to Easter and beyond, may we refuse to be blinded by fears, prejudices, past experiences, or internalized toxic narratives. May we claim the power to tell the story, our story and God's story, and in the process claim the power to be agents of change, to change the narrative, to be instruments of God's love, justice, and compassion in the face of a news cycle dominated by fear, injustice, and oppression, trusting always in the divine power that gives us victory even over death. Amen.